They said the candles in St. Roch learned to breathe, that on fog mornings the nave filled with a low, persuasive sound like a mouth refusing to be answered, and that a wick pinched between wetted fingers would hiss, dim to an ember the color of old bone, and then stand back up and take air again as if it had been taught manners by a river. I put my thumb and forefinger to one of them in August of 1889, long after the year men still call the fever, and felt the sting move through spit the way camphor cuts water. The light shrank, rested, and climbed back up. A child in a doorway, remembering its lesson. The wax under it had puddled and gone brittle in a pattern that looked like a map, and a fly stuck one foot and then shook it free and looped away as if shame-bent. The smell under the smoke was not the sweet of beeswax alone. It had a note of clean and of sickness mixed, the hospital tang of something boiled and strong, and under that a faint turpentine that I would later find in a drawer with old bills of lading. A bell rope, tasseled and stiff from years of baptisms, hung without moving. The flames paid it no mind. Outside the shutters, the cypress roots held the Bayou bank like hands learning to pray. The women who cleaned the rail watched me put my fingers to the wick and said nothing, because there is a point after which a man must earn whatever he wants to know from wood and air without help. The parish then was Saint Roch au Marais, on the La Fourche, though men with ledgers and coats called it something they could pronounce. The church is small, whitewashed, with a roof of cypress shingles that shed rain until they do not. The nave is a single room with a shelf of saints along the south wall. Roch with his dog, a heart scabbed with pins and ribbons for the sacred. 1. A small St. Louis that looks like he does not like the weather. The pews are narrow, hand-planed, polished by decades of skirts and coats. The floor is brick under the middle and packed earth under the back benches where people arrive late and pretend they meant to. Behind the apse, a sacristy holds a chest with 3 locks, where poor money, oil, and the rector's one good stole live like cousins with a shared temper. The rectory leans. The kitchen smells of coffee gone bitter and cane gone wrong at the mill. Water can be seen out the west window, always moving whether a man is prepared to be persuaded or not. I had come to do what I always do, to put paper in order, to pull mice out of minute books, and dry the ink that had bled into its own shame, and I found instead a room trained by season and terror into a sentence that the county never wrote. The year in the chest was 1834, in a hand that shifts mid-letter the way a man's voice does when a child coughs in the next room. Yellowjack, the elders will call it if you let them use that word. Others will not name it because a name brings a face into a room. New Orleans had its Board of Health by then, printing broadsides with advice to bleach floors with lye, fumigate. With vinegar, avoid night air as if night itself were an organ of infection. Men burned tar in barrels and gunpowder in pans because smoke looked like something your hands had made and therefore something a man could undo. Down here, along the elastic water that comes and goes in its own grammar, the saint they turned to was Roch, who fed people in other years and who, in the art, lifts his hem to show the wound the saint has made into his credentials. 9 nights of Novena had been the parish's habit even before the fever taught them to keep it in a new key. In the rector's book, a line in French says succinctly enough, the nation within a nation, 9 jours, 9 bougies, pas de nuit pour dormir, and below in an English hand that has learned to be too careful. By order of the committee, candles to be kept burning at all hours until the mercy be apparent. Dr. Henry Valade came upriver that summer from Chartres Street with a letter from the board, and a nose for the things that pretend to cleanliness. He was a man who had set bones and lanced boils and bled men for fevers, because that was what science had to sell then. He also wiped his hands with vinegar the way his professor in Paris had taught him and believed in a miasma he could smell. The midwife here was called Evangeline by some, and just La Vieille by others. She smelled of tobacco and of camphor from the little blue bottle she used when a child's breath got lost. In the yard beyond the church, under the live oak, A woman called Celestine kept a pot of rice warm for grave diggers and for anyone who would put enough sugar into his mouth to keep himself walking. She carried a child on her hip whose eyes were set the way marsh birds are. The sacristan was called Baptiste. He kept a ledger of candles the way a man keeps inventory of nails, and in his notes that summer he stopped writing numbers and began writing prayers. They ordered candles because paper prefers solutions in lists. To be supplied by the Ursuline house, 4 crates of devotional wax. To add the tinctures advised in the circular of March, storax, benzoin, camphor, in the hopes that aromatics may repel the poisonous atmosphere. The circular sits in the chest still, smelling faintly through itself. Its ink has moved like water on a map where someone has licked a finger and pointed. The beeswax came upriver in boxes tied with cheap ribbon, the kind that leaves dye on fingers in August. The wicks were of good linen. Someone, Baptiste would say the father, Evangeline would say the women, Valade would say the last person you wanted to be clever, drew camphor through the wax until the candles burned a little hotter and burned a little longer and could not be shamed. They lit 9 on the first night and 9 more at midnight and 9 more for the souls. The dog under St. Roch looked pleased with the arrangement. A night breeze made a move at the shutter and was told it could apologize to the door. The father had them close the windows against drafts. The smoke had no intention of leaving by any exit not of its choosing. Candles do as they are told by oxygen and by habit. The war against air began with a devout boy who had been tasked to keep the stubs from the foot of the statue. He pinched, one between wetted fingers, as he had been shown, because it had leaned and was fattening into the puddle under the saint, and the wick pulled itself back and then re-grabbed breath through the camphor. He yelped and then watched his small accident become doctrine. Father Augustin wrote in the margin of the Novena book, "Sign in the 9th hour, a candle would not be put out, St. Roch has set his guard." Valade wrote, in his compact script on the back of a handbill, "Wicks treated, resist the snuffer, smoke increased, air poor," and then added in a tone men use when trying to be borrowed by a miracle, "if the people will open the shutters." Evangeline, in a note to the midwives, said, "Put vinegar under the nose. Do not sleep inside. The church is made of breath. People crowd toward a sure thing when water moves." Men came with hats off and hair already wet and watched this new obedience, the reluctant dying and the sudden return, and called their wives away from windows they had left open to let linen remember the wind. Celestine pinned her child's shirt to her dress and went up and down with a pitcher, dipping it where it did not stamp, waking those who had promised to keep hours like fishermen and had taken their sit-down too deep. Baptiste went to and fro with a snuffer and a pin and had less success than his father had had the year the sugar went bad and men thought sulfur in the corners would correct it. The candles learned to be an argument men lost on purpose. The novena that should have been 9 seemed to lengthen the way a thrown rope does, the father a hand's breadth further on each day from declaring the mercy obvious enough to satisfy the conscience and save the breath. "A few more nights," he told his ledger, and then wrote the same thing in the margin of the minutes of the committee because paper likes its penances collected. Valade did not stop. He asked the father for shutters, for cracks, for vent, for patience the way a man asks God for weather. He set pots of vinegar in the windows when no one looked. He went down to the water in the heat and rinsed a cloth and put it on his own face and felt that he might have made a very small difference to one set of lungs. He put a hand to one of the candles when the nave grew close and felt the small deceptive cool the flame makes, and then the stealthy bite at the finger pads, and saw exactly the way the wick took its chance when a draft moved under the pews, where men had put their boots. He made the boy open a shutter while Father Augustin looked at his book and declared to nobody that the Lord would not be offended by a draft. He counted. He put that number in his pocket and kept it. The Bayou offered its education anyway. Men who worked in the cane along the back levee came in with a look at the skin that a doctor learns to understand whether or not he will be given leave to help. They had been made to sleep one night in the church because a house with open eaves and a hearth is a sin if the fever is in the parish. They were given a bench and a corner of a quilt and the smell of camphor to teach them about air. One of them vomited black into a pan, and the candle at his shoulder guttered, and then found the way a draft moved above the pan and stood up again and did not die. Evangeline held a child whose whites had gone yellow and whispered a prayer that was the same in French and in English, and in a language none of the town would own if you put it in print. Celestine put her own mouth to the rim of a bowl to test the bitterness in it, and tasted camphor and tallow and learned what devotion is when it puts itself on lips. You want a one-line cause, a thing that will fit on a clerk's wisp and be tied with red silk. There is none. There is camphor and storax and benzoin drawn into good wax in obedience to an instruction that thought odors cured airs. There are wicks cut in a stout linen that will not put itself out if there is any kindness. Of oxygen in the room, there are shutters bolted against drafts because drafts look like discourtesy. There are human bodies 5 dozen and then more pressing heat and humidity and breath into a room just large enough to trap a doctrine. There is a board of health in a city which believes vinegar absolves the person who pours it. There is faith, which is the manner a parish puts on in the face of water to keep itself from turning rude with panic. There is a doctor with a paper, and a midwife with a nose, and a woman with a pot of rice, and a child whose eyes know where to look in a room, at a flame that knows its own mind without their permission. On the 4th night, the father wrote, "Left. Candle at the saint all night to say that we will not grow tired. And on the 5th, more candles for the benches. Let there be light. And on the 7th, mercy has been asked and not denied." On the 10th, he did not write at all. The minutes of the committee for that night record, in a hand beginning to learn how to hold a pen in a glove, community satisfied with the miracle, to continue per father. Baptiste's wax ledger is honest about the theft. 1 crate. Done, 2 taken from the rectory, wicks low on chest, will melt ends. In that same book, he begins noting with a trifling scruple the places where wax fell and stuck. A puddle by St. Roch's dog, a spill on the 5th pew back, a run over the rail by the low lady's elbow. As if marking these down on a page made a woman less likely to sit where she had sat and put her face on her own hands and forget mean air for 3 minutes. It is not the case that the candles would burn underwater or that a hurricane came and could not shame the flames into lying down. It is the case that in the 2nd week, a boy set a snuffer over a wick and drew it away and found orange under it anyway, because camphor does that to a wick when it is taught to be conversant with the room. It is the case that the room denied the window, because the window denied the novena. It is the case that men put sacks of salt by the door and cut them with knives to draw wet out of the air and the floor and the women's hands until the sacks were dark puddles, and the salt itself learned to be a sponge. It is the case that Evangeline wrote in her causerie to the midwives, "Do not go in with child. You will water your eyes and your lungs, and the baby will want it and you will not know how to come back out." And 3 went in anyway. It is the case that Celestine's child died in the morning of the 7th, and she kept the pitcher going and the spoons moving because if she did not move, she would find the still that was waiting behind her left shoulder and would have to hold it with her hands. They blamed her because a Bayou town practices its manners until there are none left. If someone holds out longer than you can stand, she will be made to stand out of doors. It was the woman with the hair like cane plume who suggested in a voice that had learned to make itself respectable that Celestine be allowed to make her own vigil in the baptistry, as befits one whose life is half in and half out of grace. The word took itself into the minutes as devout. They put her there with 9 candles because numbers keep men from knowing what they have done, and a blanket, because mercy is a thing you can count and feel yourself good for, and told her to ask the saint to put its hand on the fever. They closed the door because someone coming in late might be offended by the sight of a woman at prayer. They put a pan of vinegar under the grate because instructions written a fortnight earlier in town need no knowledge of particular rooms. Father Augustine stood at the rail and said the litany, which names plague between lightning and famine. Valad stood at the apse corner and counted between the time a snuffer covered a wick and the time it stood up again. And he put that number into his hand, as if he had been given something to hold. She was not found until morning. Even in a swamp, a room shuts air down with stubborn speed when you give it 9 obedient flames and a woman's body. The baptistry's lid had been left off because men do not fear water catching when there is water close, and the font had collected, a white bloom that nobody was foolish enough to touch. The candles near her had sweated their own resin onto the floor bricks. They stood, some tall, some less so. One had burned right down to a pin of wick and a pin's worth of will. Evangeline put the palm of her hand on the bricks where the wax, kept its heat, and counted 2. And then in the space before any word could rescue what had happened, she counted 1, not because it would help, but because the body insists upon finishing a sequence. The fathers wrote it down as an over-ardent vigilia, and the women coughed and did not look at the baptistry door because spit has too much truth in it. The novena did not stop. In a ledger in the chest, there is a list of those admitted into the church to keep the light through the night from going alone to do what men had set it to do. The breathers were assigned watch, as if to a levee or a fire. At the bottoms of the pages, the cure has written in his hand, "Ne pas dormir." Valad went down to the water for good one morning and had himself put in a skiff with his bag and his clean linen. He went upriver where a parish would let him take shutters off and take sheets out and set mercies out of doors. He wrote a note in the sacristy book before he left. "Mix less camphor, your air is poor," and one of the saints nodded because it is their occupation to agree. Evangeline and a girl who always wore red thread around her wrist opened the shutters when Father Augustine left the room and then closed them again, and burned their fingers and then held them in water and tasted camphor on their own skin. The candles learned to go out only when the room taught itself to come apart, and by then the fever had found whatever it is that fed it more than fear. I do not offer you ghosts. Camphor, benzoin, beeswax drawn in a certain way, shuttered drafts, a pan of vinegar with its own small sense of order, and the insistence of the human mind upon a pattern, this would do. The ledger will not tell you Celestine's name, a brown thumbprint on a page in the sacristy that smells like liewill. The boy in the baptistry wrote his initials on the back of a tile with a nail before they shut the door, and years later a workman found them when he replaced the cracked clay with something that did not carry stories for so long as the old stuff did. Father Augustine went on to a place inland where wind could be counted upon to have the manners of open fields, and his last entry in St. Roch's book is not about mercy, but ordering more candles from the Ursulines. Baptiste learned the way to cut wick without encouraging it to talk back. In the chest at the bottom, under a scroll of lace that has taken on the yellow that linen learns from hands, is a little board with a sample of wick pinned to it and a note, "N'est pas traité si bien," and under that in English so that somebody's family would not pretend not to read, "Do not teach it to live too well." The candles now, in August when I stand there and make my fingers burn, have learned the compromise. They die if asked to with a firm glove. They burn if given half a chance. On certain fog mornings when the Bayou leans its breath into the nave, a wick that has been properly pinched and left alone will stand up and find an ember under the bit. That has been told it is done, and it will take it back. The air will learn its place. The bell under the rope will be still. Outside, where the cypress knees hold bank and men pretend they have taught water any lesson that matters, the frogs will answer this doctrine with their own. If you put your finger to the wick and then to your tongue, you will taste camphor and iron. If you put your ear to the rail, you will hear a room refuse to be shamed. If you ask me for a verdict, I will tell you 9 nights teach a parish the math it will use on every other problem for a century. The candles that would not die did not bring the fever in. They kept a doctrine breathing until breath had nothing to do with love. In the end, men count in the only way they can raise in rooms like this. 2 for what they would prefer to call a sign, and 1 for the patience it requires to open a shutter and leave a door kindly ajar. In the weeks after, the parish practiced amnesia, like a craft. You could see it in the way the shutters regained their varnish as if handprints were an indecency, and in the way the nave learned to smell again of wax without the wrong brightness under it. There is a way a town sets its jaw when it has almost consented to learn and refuses at the last. Father Augustine, who had written, "Mercy asked and not denied," let the minutes sit open in the chest until their edges curled. The committee paid the Ursulines for 2 more crates. Baptiste took the wicks in hand, with a fastidiousness that had not been taught to him in childhood, and raked them between his fingers until they were right. Evangeline tied red thread round the wrists of 3 mothers who had carried low that summer and let the thread trail a little so it would not tighten if fear did. Celestine's name did not enter any book, but at the back of the sacristy door, a hand that had learned letters on prayer cards put down in pencil, "La scie à la fond," and then rubbed it away with a thumb until only the grease remained. What? Shame wrote in one room, the Bayou wrote in another with better ink. Downriver at the quarantine station, where the state keeps old water moored to a dock with new paper, the register ran its own sequence. Schooner, brig, packet, fever on board? No. Yes. Yellow. The men in coat tails, whose French mispronounced the life out of this parish, wrote, "Fumigate with vinegar," and "burn tar," and "allow no night air." In their drawer lay a pamphlet printed in the city with the neat audacity of science. On aromatic candles for the event of miasma. The list would read like a recipe if you did not know where it had led. Beeswax, storax, oriental, the note insists, as if it mattered, benzoin, camphor, oils cut with spirits. The last line, printed small, read, "Caution, wicks must be trimmed to prevent re-illumination." A sister at the Ursulines, faithful to instructions that required a bent back and a clean conscience, had sent the same measures to St. Roch without the caution. It is not a haunting when paper succeeds in being exactly itself. I made a journey to the city because the chest had taught me its limits. In Chartres Street, I stood under a gallery that had learned to hold weight without looking like it minded and asked to see the dispensary book. The sisters, who have a manner of letting you do what you say until you prove yourself a fool, set down in front of me a ledger whose pages smelled of fennel and vinegar and something sweeter. In a small hand, a woman had copied with all charity a formula sent from France and set it beside a list of parishes. "To Saint Rochaud-Marais," she had written, and under that the phrase that would not leave the page no matter how long the air worked at it. "Mix well. Draw through the wax. Let the wicks be of stout linen that will not discourage the devotion." In the margin, someone else had written in a hand that did not belong in that house, because it belonged to a man. Less. And then a blot, where he had withdrawn the pen because house and habit give a person no better place to put his urgency. You cannot live on a bayou and stop at the doors of houses as if a story begins only when a plank does. The cane held a heat that made even the breeze smell of blanching. The levee creaked as if it meant to learn English. In the graveyard, the ironwork pretended to keep the weeping angel from taking her chores to a field where she could act. The ex-votos at St. Roch, wax hands, wax heads, wax hearts with holes where a pin had once made a petition in matter, had softened that summer enough that some learned to lean. A leg fell and broke at the ankle as if admitting out loud would have been less than it could bear. The mothers picked up pins and moved them. Men who had promised to do nothing more than open the shutters when the room grew thick turned their heads and put their hands in their pockets. Baptiste grew old. Between one summer and the next, when I came back in October, he had put the wick board in the bottom of the chest and had taken to crossing the nave without looking at his own feet. His knees had the humility of a ladder placed badly. He showed me a drawer in the sacristy table that fit not with any carpenter's pride, but with the tolerances people teach wood when everything else is losing its mind. A swallow, loose, a candle pin, a wedge of storax hard as resignation. Between two sheets of paper lay a thread of linen fuse the length of a wrist, stained with a faint brown where a finger had held it when it went through wax. He said nothing. His mouth held, the way a person's does when prayer is the only thing a man will say and he has learned its limits for himself. In the evenings that fall, when the mosquitoes declared themselves without interest in argument and the frogs made their cases in all the registers they could afford, the candles burned as they ought, sobriety's little boats. A draft moved. A wick went down under a snuffer without insisting. On fog mornings, they had their own way. The bell on its rope slept. Under the door, you could watch the cigarette of mist lay itself across the bricks with the slow authority of a ledger line. In that air, the wicks remembered their education. You could pinch a flame to a black bead, wait, and then, if your fingers had not shaken the last word of heat loose, watch it throw a spark the color of dried orange back toward its wick. It is not a miracle. It is wax drawn inhospitably, and a parish unwilling to admit it has learned the smallest thing about breath. The names from 1834 did not leave me. There is a certain obedience that journals require of a person who reads them. You start looking for a phrase in one book and find it on the inside of your own mouth as you are about to put other food there. In a ribbon-bound packet under the minutes lay Celestine's initials only once, and not in a hand that would have owned her if asked. It belonged to a woman who cleaned the pews. Her span of letters wanted to be smaller than her knuckles would allow. Child buried, she wrote, because it would not do to say what she had actually done with her hands that day. In a clay pipe bowl under the low bench by the door to the baptistry, someone had left a bit of beeswax with a smear of white on it. No ghost comes from beeswax, but if you put it to your tongue before you think, you will, and wait for the room. To decide what you have done, there is a thread there of what the old ledger taught me to expect. Camphor, vinegar, iron. It is the vocabulary this parish uses for itself in the dark. The water kept time without permission. In late September and early October, storms made their rounds the way a person goes from door to door with a pot and knows where the ladle will come back richer. A notice went up at the back of the nave, polite, using due to like a great city's clerk would. Due to the danger of high water, if such be God's pleasure, the room does not let you trim that, the novena may be moved to an earlier hour. It is a sentence that does not hold. On the third day of the new vigil, the sky changed its mind 3 times in a quarter hour and then blew itself out to the gulf. The windows were open, and then they were shut, and the candles learned the old arrogance and stood against a pin as if the pin had offended them rather than touched. Father Augustine's replacement, a man with a beard that made it necessary to interpret his expressions, lifted his chin and let the candles be what the committee had paid for. The wicks, with the camphor still in them like a set jaw, loved the room more than its contents. I watched what obedience looks like when air runs out. It is small at first. A man who has worked cane takes a slow breath and does not choose to stand up when he would have. A woman eases her shoulders off the pew back as if her body has decided to see if lying would do. In the first benches, men make the small adjustments people make when a boy is born, and women can keep their own sins. Leaning, a hand on a rail, a neck that stands up to complain and then is made to go gently down. The candles, taught to live. Too well, take on their own appetite. Evangeline walked the aisle with a towel on her arm the way a person might at a feast in a house that means to do right but has misread one recipe. She set bowls under faces that needed bowls, and sent girls to open shutters and set men to the door with hands on the peg. The father raised his hands and the candles had their wrong say. What stopped them was not a saint. It was a gust that had spent itself throwing cypress at the road. It hit the west wall with the mild contempt the Gulf reserves for wooden good intentions, and blew the shutter in and made the flames lie down. It went out again, and the wicks stood with one mind, finding dry at their own root faster than any apology could outrun it. And then Evangeline, who still wore red thread only from stubbornness now and not belief, picked up the water she had meant for a child and threw it at a row of little saints until the row set up a steam that made 3 men cough their lessons into the air and put oxygen where a committee could not have. The father said, "It is allowed," and then put the cover back on the baptistry and sat a moment with his hands in his sleeves, because a man is permitted once in a year to see himself as he is. And then, not again. If paper wants atonement, it will take wax and let itself be stamped. The committee found a way to make minutes complain in a rhetoric men could commend. In future, any aromatics will be reduced, it wrote, and under that, on fog days, ventilate. Baptiste gathered the stub ends left at St. Roch's feet and melted them down and rolled the new wicks between his palms without adding anything to the pot. The newly made candles burned like humility the rest of that season. In December, when Bayou and sky stood politely apart and let air into the nave without language, a wick pinched between forefinger and thumb died with a decency that made no doctrine of itself. Evangeline took her thread off in a room that would not tell on her, and her wrist, when she rubbed it, turned a red that went away. Celestine's table, the only one that would tell the truth about that summer if you put your ear to it, learned again to smell only of coffee and rice and the sweat a person earns without complaint. The city sent a man with a seal and the first tiny polite germs in his mouth. He wore them the way a person wears a new word, hopeful and ashamed of loving it so much. He looked at the shutters and the floor and the foot of St. Roch and wrote down 2 of his 3 new names, the third one making him blush to a woman whose child had died within arm's reach of a font. Mosquito, miasma, and the word that would change nothing in this parish for 20 years because it came too light in his mouth. Infection. He said it this way, infection, as if hearing himself declare it, and the room would behave like a class and bring its listening to order. Evangeline's mouth made a long line because a mouth like hers has told women for 50 years what to do in that room and in this heat and in this water. And a man who had learned his kindnesses in a damp library had lifted something out of her hand and placed it on paper without asking. He left a stack of broadsides, mop with lye, wash with vinegar, vent, and took his shuttered mind back to Chartres Street, where the wind from the river is not the same as the breath in a nave. Among the things that shells keep is the exact shape of pulses people do not wish to admit they have. In a shop near the port that sold incense of the Orient, a man with the appetite of a parish supplied storax by the jar. He made little packages of benzoin like the saints make of forgiveness at pilgrimage sites and sold them to women too tired to be impressed by his talk. In a steamboat's ledger on the La Fourche, a captain lists delivered candles, devotional, 4 crates, and beside it, in another hand, dogs for St. Roch, as if the ex-votos and the wax shared a bill because everyone understood what the town wanted was to be loved by an image and to have breath enough to show it. Farther up the road to the upland, a cane man wrote on a scrap, found a year later in a trunk that had learned to smell like rope, that he had laid sacks of salt against the church wall and cut them, and that the salt ran like water and left little lakes on the bricks that dried into white maps and made his mouth point down the way a person's does when he bad news his own self. There was a letter in the chest, folded and refolded until its creases held the pride out of it. It was, From Father Augustine to the bishop. They ask me to declare a miracle, he had written, and then, in that nice change of hand a man makes when he throws a little truth in, and I am a coward. He told the bishop he would prefer to be instructed. He told the bishop about camphor and wicks and air. He told him Celestine's name without naming her, the way a book does when it wants to preserve love against the pressure paper makes on breathing. The bishop sent back a printed piece that smelled of oil and good French. Prudence, it told him. Do not treat it too well. In the margin, in the hand of a person who learned to write under red thread and candle smoke, is the justice. This parish keeps for itself. It is not the saint who kept the candle, it is us. In January, when even a South Place learns frost as a courtesy and a pew turns friendly to flesh, I went into the baptistry and let the blank water stand over its own stories. The font had its bloom again, white and fragile on brick. And if you put your finger to it, and you should not, and will, your tongue will find two flavors waiting rather than one. The thin sweetness of beeswax, long since cracked to ruin above, and the iron fine as a pen stroke that shot up my arm in 1834 into a body that now belongs to the parts of this parish that are not ashamed to be remembered. In the winter, people told their fever stories to each other with the tidy decorum of drilling militia. They all remembered the dog at St. Roch's foot. None of them remembered the part about shutters except the women. In August of the year after, the committee brought on a friar to encourage and enforce another novena because the river had gone the color that makes a man's mouth dry. They meant no harm. That is the trouble with courage in a room like this. He had a good voice and a new rope for the bell. He took the old wicks out of the chest and took a sheet of paper from the back of the book without looking at it and chewed the end of his pen. He wrote 9 nights and candles and until the mercy be apparent, and the pen bled into its own hesitation as if the page were tired and had decided to put blood at the place the friar had not thought his task required. I put a board over the wicks where he had left them on the sacristy table and set the ne pas traiter si bien on top of that, like a plate on a pot. He did not see it because his duty was too bright. On the third night, an old man who had helped raise the first rope put his hand to it again and found the strength to pull over the weight of everything he had learned. The bell's pattern is indiscreet. 2. In the polite voice, the Bayou lends to forgiveness. The long space. Then 1. Baptiste turned his head toward the sound and took a step back into a room where an old woman had been set with 2 candles and a bowl because her grandchild had fever breath, and the women had to take turns sitting with him out of fairness. He set his hand to the peg with an authority he had never been allowed at any other door and opened it. Air makes its own invocations when wood finally gets out of its way. At the end of my last month in St. Roch, the chest was in better order than it had any right to be. I wrote, "Reduce aromatics" on my own paper because someone else's is a poor place to put your insistence unless you mean to be a name man. Read again without a curse. I put into the chest the note the sister had written years ago, "Do not discourage the devotion," and set under it the note the bishop had sent, "Prudence." Between those 2 pieces of paper, a town had learned to be 2 rooms at once. The room where love makes too much heat, and the room where a woman opens a shutter and counts for the living. I went down to the bank to say a goodbye to the water in its own speech, which is grit and silt and pearl and the shrimp smell the morning keeps for itself. The cypress knees hold their poses through centuries without believing that prayer has anything to do with it. They do the work a parish puts on saints. On a day when the fog made a shore out of the nave again, and the rope on the bell was stiff, because air does not allow linen much will when it is that full of itself, I put my finger to the wick and pinched, and watched the ember sleep, and watched it turn, and it took its breath. The air in the aisle moved as if learning. The pegged door of the baptistry, left shut as a finesse of habit, breathed once at its own latches, which is to say it remembered. becoming open. If I had asked for a final image, I would be a man with no manners. I did not ask. The parish gave me one anyway. On the rail, someone had left a red thread. It lay where a woman had rubbed a wrist raw under it in a summer long gone. 2 candle, drips on that rail, one ancient, one bright, sat side by side like the friends the town had not permitted itself. When a draft came through, it moved the thread toward the old wax first, and then toward the new, with a courtesy that only air that understands is capable of. Far off, where the levee refuses to name itself anything human because it intends to leave us in the end, a boat made a long, hurt sound. In the room, it became what this parish teaches anything that likes breath to become, 2, and then a place for a person to change his mind and still be thought good by his neighbor. And then, 1. I left a page under the wick samples like a soldier leaves his mess kit where the next man can find it. Do not treat them so well, it said. And then in the language the chest had learned from the city and the country together, open. Above the baptistry, the plaster still carried a brown, narrow crescent where steam had worked itself into a memory. On the sill of a window, somebody had left a cup upside down, not because anything new had been learned, but because that was the correct way to leave a room that has failed to be either miracle or lesson without making a liar of yourself in the doing. The candle in St. Roch's niche warmed to a breath. It did not misbehave. Not then. That is a room's right. Outside, the cypress roots held the bank, the way children hold their faces when a picture is taken, too seriously to prove the moment counts. Down the road, a child licked his fingers because of sugar, and learned to his surprise something of pharmacy and of prayer at the same second, and looked up, wide-eyed, as if someone had taught him to count without telling him why it mattered. If you ask for the ending, St. Roch will teach you the bosun's answer, not the priest's. Stand by, it says in napless rope. Ready about. The bell is where someone left it. The wax in crates will be drawn with what it is told to be drawn with by hands that have learned nothing except to repeat orders, because repeating keeps other things from happening. Red thread waits for wrists. The shutter peg stands ready to be lifted by any person who has put his body where the room would be pleased not to count. I came for paper. I left with air. It has not given me back what it took. It never will. I have learned only this. The candles that would not die learned it from the parish, and the parish from the water. And if you are waiting for a man to put an end to it with his hand, you will wait 9 nights and 9 more. And in the fog you will count. You will always count, until the day you mind your body away from a wick and open a door instead, and even then the ember in the air will behave like a good child, sleeping,